Thanks for the invitation. I apologize or say you're welcome to the presence of Wilbur, the polydactyl cat, who will be walking back and forth through the evening. That is his thing. He insists on being between me and the camera at all times. So I'm going to share my screen and pop into the keynote here. And does that work? Can you see that picture of the book there?
Yes.
Okay, so this is, as Amy mentioned, a 620-page book, but the chapter was very huffy about limiting my time to under 11 hours. So I'm just going to give you a condensed version, which is How to Prepare for Climate Change, the talk. So the book was inspired by this quote that John Holdren made. He was Obama's science advisor. And he was talking about climate change to the New York Times. He said, we basically have three choices: mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. We're going to do some of each. The question is what the mix is going to be. Well, you guys know what mitigation is. It's trying to stop climate change, put out fewer emissions. Super important, and we all need to do that with every fiber of our being. But adaptation means trying to cope with what we've got. And you don't hear a lot about that. These are the books I found on Amazon that are about mitigation. I mean, there's hundreds of them. And now I'm going to show you all the books I could find about adaptation. It's mine. That's it. There is nothing else. I mean, corporations and governments do adaptation. That's building seawalls and developing seeds that do better in drought. That's adaptation. But what if you're a person? What if you're a family? What if you're a couple? Nothing. There's nothing out there. So that was the goal of the book, is to cover every conceivable angle of
ready, help yourselves.
Adaptation. I'm going to warn you now, there's kind of two parts to this talk. There's going to be a depressing part, and then at the end, it's going to be a shakily reassuring part. I did try to find a mask image that would represent depressing and shakily reassuring. Obviously, the one you see here is badly done in Photoshop. If you've ever wondered what it's like to Google something and get no results, yeah, that's it. Shakily reassuring masks. So first of all, I'd like to object strenuously to the terminology that we as climate leaders and writers and opinionators use. I think the greenhouse effect is a terrible name. Most people have never been in a greenhouse. They don't know that it's 20 degrees warmer in there than it is outside. I think if we really want to explain it, we should say it's the dog in the car effect. You know, like you come back to your car in the summer and it's like broiling inside. It's the same exact thing as what's happening to the planet. Trapped infrared energy from the sun is reflected off the fabric of the car, the upholstery. That's why you're not supposed to leave your dog in there. In the climate change analogy, we're the dog. I have another term I don't like: global warming. Global warming makes people think that it's just a problem of the world getting warmer. It's a lot more complicated than that. And by the way, just while we were waiting, one of you, I forgot to note your name, but mentioned that another speaker has been saying she doesn't like the term fossil fuels, that they should be more properly called extinction fuels, because that's where the fuel came from and that's where they're taking us. I'm using that. I'm stealing that. But for anyone who thinks that, you know, that global warming is about warmer temperatures, does this look like warming to you? You know, this was Austin in February. They don't have snow plows or salt trucks in Austin. People don't even have winter jackets. And yet 10 million people without power in this freak snowstorm, costliest storm in the history of Texas. And you know who else thinks that global warming means warmer temperatures everywhere all the time? This guy, the congressman who walked into Congress with a snowball and said, "You can't tell me there's global warming." So we got to acknowledge it's a lot more complicated than that. The climate crisis isn't just warming. It's heat waves and it's freak snows. It's droughts and intense rains. It's flooding and it's water shortages all at the same time. wildfires, hurricanes, biodiversity loss. You guys in Portland, above all, know about the 100,000 trees a day that are being eaten by those beetles. I mean, nature is a network of interconnected systems, right? It's dominoes. You can't turn one knob without affecting a bunch of other things. And what's more interesting to me, not more alarming, but more interesting, is the secondary and tertiary effects that nobody talks about. All of these things are a result of the changing climate. The tornado alley that used to be limited to the barren open plain states is now shifting and growing to the east into the way more populated states. And if you look at the states there, you'll realize those tend to be the less affluent states where the housing stock is built flimsy. So the tornadoes are hitting people in Tennessee and Mississippi and killing people and knocking over their homes. Smaller beaches, more expensive chocolate, more kidney stones, smaller goats. And here's the one that really gets their attention here in Connecticut: lower PSAT scores. Yes, all of these things are secondary effects of the changing climate. So I don't like the term global warming. I would suggest one of these terms: climate breakdown, global weirding. I like a lot. That's a lot more descriptive. I've been told that I can skip for you guys the crash course in what causes the changing climate, the thickening of the layer of greenhouse gases and all that you've had plenty of experience with that. But the truth is 2020 and 2021 were terrible years for a lot of reasons. That's not an earth-shaking observation. We had the pandemic, but during the pandemic, the climate crisis went right on ahead. We achieved some really historic milestones in the last couple of years. We had the hottest temperature ever measured on the face of the earth in all human history, 131 degrees in Death Valley. We had the most wildfires in a single season, 5 million acres burned in the California and Oregon and Washington. That's the entire area of Connecticut, Delaware, and Rhode Island put together. You can see the trend line for wildfires has a very clear diagonal slope up. 2020, we had the most hurricanes in the season, so many that the World Meteorological Organization ran out of alphabetical names to name them. So they had to trot out Greek letters to name the additional hurricanes that season. And I'm sure you remember this from elementary school. This is the water cycle. So the ocean warms up, the water evaporates, it condenses into clouds, it rains back down as precipitation, the water runs back into the sea, and so on. The problem, as Mr. Gore taught us in our training, is that of all the heat that's building up on the planet, 93% of it is in the oceans. So that is supercharging the water cycle. And if you need any proof of that, this is a graph of how many extreme rainstorms we've been having in the last 100 years. You can see that too is decidedly going up. And it's not just here. I mean, everywhere in the world, we're seeing these massive freak floods. In Nebraska, 2/3 of all the counties 3 years ago, counties had a state of emergency, leaving 20 million unplantable acres in the breadbasket state there unplantable. If you want to know why grocery prices went up that year, there you go. And here's something else I learned from the climate training. This is the one laugh you're going to get today. This is the Noah's Ark replica in Kentucky. It's a tourist attraction. And yes, indeed, they filed for a $1 million insurance claim for flooding. It doesn't get more ironic than that. But this supercharged water cycle is also what's responsible for the size of these hurricanes, not just the quantity. I lived through Hurricane Sandy here in Connecticut. The biggest hurricane ever recorded. I mean, it was awful. This is New York City, 45 minutes from my house. We lost power and everything else here in this house. So it was cold. We lost everything in the refrigerator and the freezer. I had 3 little kids with no TV, no internet, no nothing. And for the first hour, you're like, oh, this is exciting, kids. I'll we'll learn how they lived in the olden days. We'll light candles, we'll play card games. And yeah, that lasted like an hour. And then it was just bad. So the alarming thing is that the science says that the frequency of storms that big is getting much more frequent. We're expected to have one of those every 5 years, starting in the 2030, the mid-century. So if you add all this stuff up, the flooding, the storms, the heat, the drought, the fires, you can see that overall, the number of billion-dollar events a year we're getting is really sneaking up. Yale has this cool think tank, this climate change communications group, and they do a poll a couple times a year on what Americans think of the climate crisis. And a lot of people say to me, well, what am I supposed to say to a climate denier? And I honestly think there aren't climate deniers left. I don't think there's anyone who with a straight face can look out the window and say, oh yeah, this is how it was in the 80s. Nothing's changed. Yeah, this is exactly the weather I grew up with. I mean, if they're saying that, they're lying or delusional. What we do have is people who deny that there's any anthropomorphic and any man-made element to the climate crisis. And even those numbers are shrinking every time they do this poll. In the latest one at the end of last year, we were down to 29% of Americans saying, oh no, this isn't human caused, this isn't anthropogenic, this is just a natural cycle. And you might say, well, 29%, that's still a lot of people. I don't know. Anytime you can get over 50% of Americans to agree on anything, I think you're doing pretty well. Let me remind you that 20% of Americans believe that aliens walk among us. So, you be the judge there. So for my purposes for the book and for the talk, though, whether you believe the changing climate is man-made or a natural cycle, it really doesn't matter. Either way, you've got to adapt. You've got to prepare. So that's the gist of the book. And so these are the chapters. It's all about where to live and how to insure, how to build, how to grow, where to invest, how to talk to your kids. And then there's individual chapters for flood, heat waves, drought, tornadoes, and so on. I'm going to cherry pick some of the most interesting stuff for tonight, including chapter 1, which is called Acclimating to Climate Change. It's all about this new field of eco-anxiety. It's people, it's a mental health issue caused by the changing climate. The first element of this is post-traumatic stress. This is after you've lived through one of these disasters. After Hurricane Katrina, 1 in 5 New Orleans residents were still suffering from PTSD a year later, and suicidal thoughts had doubled. Then there's pre-traumatic stress. This is worrying about what's going to happen. A lot of us are doing a lot of that. The numbers are unbelievable. There are anxiety diagnoses in America since 2016 rose 40% to the beginning of the pandemic and rose another 25% during the pandemic. That's not all climate anxiety, but the climate stuff is a big factor. And then there's a third one that I hadn't heard of called Solastalgia. And that's defined as mourning the loss of a place that you haven't left. It's the place where you still are living, but you miss how it used to be. You miss the changing of the leaves, which are becoming less colorful here on the East Coast, or how much fall and spring you used to get as compared to now. So there's one answer to all of this. There are ecotherapy groups now, and there are ecotherapists who treat environmental melancholia. And one thing they'll all tell you is depression is not just, oh, my situation sucks. Depression is defined as my situation sucks and I can't do anything about it. It's the feeling of helplessness over your situation. So therefore, the most effective way to deal with climate despair is to do something, is to take some kind of action so you feel like you have some control. And there are all kinds of different ways to do that. You can practice mitigation. You can help a campaign get public, join an advocacy group. You can go into therapy. And there's a bunch of classic stress relief things you can try. A couple of which, by the way, I'm not an expert on anything in this book. I'm not a guru about investment or insurance or anything. This was a reporting job, this book. This is all about interviewing experts all over the world and summarizing their advice. And I spoke to 5 eco-therapists, and a couple of them mentioned the worry hour. I love this so much. So the idea is you're allowing yourself to wallow in your misery and you're feeling sorry for yourself once a day at 4 p.m. or whatever time you pick. Every day at 4 o'clock, you can just sit there and dwell on how much your life sucks. But the other 23 hours, if one of those thoughts enters your head, you say, that's not till tomorrow at 4. And they've studied this. They've done controlled research studies. They've done it. It works in the military. It works among women. It works among teenagers. I mean, it works. And anyway, I've changed lives by mentioning that simple little brain hack. Anyway, all of this together may be why this book has been called the first uplifting book on climate change. And the woman who said that was my editor. But still, I mean, she's totally unbiased. She has a good sense of what's true. The whole book is about taking action, right? The whole book is about taking control of the situation. And that's why it ultimately makes you feel better. The chapter that most people ask me about is the Where to Live chapter. Not everybody has the means to get up and move, obviously, but 40 million Americans do move every year. Many of them have to. Many of them might have a choice of where. Maybe you're getting married or divorced, you're getting a new job or getting out of the military or college. And so if you do have the ability to factor in the climate crisis into where you're going, well, there's no place that's completely exempt. Every place in the country has something going on. But basically, the gist goes like this. You want to be north far enough to escape the heat and the mosquitoes and the ticks. You want to be west far enough to avoid the hurricanes and the sea level rise. There's a cool website I discovered working on the book called Surging Seas. It's run by Climate Central. This is where I live, Westport, Connecticut. And if you drag the slider at the left to the number of feet you expect the ocean to rise, or just to experiment with it, people say, oh, you know, the IPCC says, you know, the sea level might rise 6 to 9 feet by the end of the century. You're like, 6 feet, you know, build a higher dock. But what you forget is that for every 1 foot up the water rises, it goes inland 300 feet. So that's, you know, the businesses and the restaurants and so on. So you put in any address you want on this website, and then you can sit there and watch the water encroach as you drag that slider up. So I live in a coastal town that is going to become a lot less coastal. Here's Boston. That situation is even worse. I mean, that's a low-lying flat city right on the water. And they've got big problems, but the problems there are not as bad as Miami. You guys, Miami is going away. And in fact, the whole southern tip of Florida is going away. I mean, you can't build seawalls around the southern tip of Florida because the ground is porous, right? The water comes up from underneath you. So they have this problem in Miami called sunny day flooding. That's when you get flooded streets when it hasn't rained. There hasn't been a storm. There are little storm drains in all the streets that were designed to let water run out to the sea. And now instead, the water is coming in the wrong direction. It's coming from the sea into the streets and flooding it out. I guess this guy here is feeding the meter to park his submarine. Not quite sure. Anyway, you also want to be east far enough to avoid the wildfires, and you need fresh water. Not a lot of people are talking about the freshwater thing, but it is really, really serious. It's not as telegenic as a wildfire, like setting up the evening news camera, pointing at a reservoir that's partly empty. Basically, in this country, we get our water from three places. Out where you guys live, it comes from the snowpack. That is, during the winter, the snow collects on the mountains, and in the spring, it melts and provides a steady stream of water running down the creeks. But by 2050, they expect there to be no more snow-dominant regions left. And by 2080, they expect there will be no snowpack at all. You can see it happening in this satellite photo of the West Coast. So you can see the Sierra Nevadas there 10 years ago, and now you can already see that the snowpack is disappearing before our eyes. We also get our water from reservoirs, and 100% of the major US reservoirs are at historic lows. This is Lake Mead. This is the Hoover Dam lake, man-made lake. We used to get a lot of our water from this reservoir. It's now under a third full. It's dropped 117 feet in 20 years. You can see that the bathtub ring there, the white rock, that's supposed to be the level of Lake Mead. Another couple of feet, they're not going to be able to generate hydropower anymore. And then a few feet beyond that, and they won't be able to get water anymore. And the third source is aquifers. These are these deep underground storage caverns of water, and dissolved in sediment and sand and gravel. And 21 of the 37 biggest ones we've got are now past what they call the tipping point. That's the point at which we are not refilling them from rain as fast as we are drawing from them. So once you pass the tipping point, the aquifer is on its way out. So it's really bad. This was from a couple months ago in the Times, pointing out that this is the worst drought you guys have had since Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Empire in 800 AD. It's the worst drought the Southwest has had in 1,200 years. So how do you avoid all these nightmares? Well, the answer is Great Lakes, baby. You've got unlimited fresh water in the Great Lakes. You are north far enough to avoid the heat waves. You're inland far enough from the ticks and the hurricanes and the sea level. And by the way, it's not just a climate haven, these grand old Rust Belt cities. They also have a lot of things to speak for them for quality of life. In the book, I picked out 15 of these cities to profile. So for example, Cleveland, where I grew up, they have world-class museums, sports teams, hospitals, an airport only 15 minutes from downtown, and an incredibly low cost of living. I mean, I don't know if any of you live in Portland, but the cost of living is so much lower in some of these cities. $1 in New York City will buy you $2.71 in Cleveland. I mean, but then you have to live in Cleveland, but still, you get the point. Madison, Wisconsin comes up as #1 over and over in surveys and magazines and blog posts. It's the fittest city, nicest city, best to raise a family, and so on. They have 5 lakes. It's all nestled among these lakes, fantastic outdoor recreation. And they have this rule, this law, that you're not allowed to build a building higher than the state capitol building that you're seeing here. So it can never become a concrete jungle. It's a beautiful place. And I know you're like, oh, but it's cold there in the winter. Yeah, well, not as cold as it used to be. The lowest lows of the winter have gone up 5 degrees since the 80s and expected to go up another 11 degrees by the middle of the century. So not as cold as you think. Same thing with Burlington. Burlington is cool because it feels like a seaside town, but it's on a lake, this gigantic 500-mile lake, Lake Champlain. So it's like a seaside town, but without the sea. They have low obesity, highly educated populace, the lowest crime rate in the country, and really good cheese, maple syrup, and ice cream. Buffalo, right on Lake Erie. They have fantastic medical facilities, really cheap land, and excellent chicken wings. Okay, so another chapter that I found interesting and troubling was where to invest. there was this conversation I had with my editor about whether to even include a chapter like this. Isn't it a little bit crass to talk about getting rich off the end of the earth? And, the more I talk to these experts, the more I realize, well, no, it's probably a good idea to talk about that, because anytime you persuade people to invest in companies that are making things cleaner, you are in effect helping the whole world. So this is all about where you can put your money, where you will make money as it decarbonizes the planet. I shouldn't have to sell anybody on the wisdom of investing in clean stocks. This graph shows the regular stock market's growth over the last 20 years, last 10 years on the top line. The bottom line is what the petroleum industry has done, the traditional energy stocks. So if you'd invested $1,000 4 years ago in clean energy stocks, you'd be up 60%. And if you'd invested that in Exxon and so on, you'd be down 12%. So it's a losing bet now to invest in fossil fuels. The first thing you might think of for investment is, oh, how about solar? Because we all know solar is the future. I think that's pretty obvious that we're at that future, and we're at that future a lot quicker than anybody thought. The amount of solar power generated in this country is geometrically skyrocketing. Last year, here's a takeaway stat for you. Last year, of all the new electricity capacity built in the US, 77% was renewable and 0% was coal. There are no more coal plants planned for the United States. In fact, we're taking them offline. Coal is dead in this country. As Mr. Gore pointed out, the Kentucky Coal Mine Museum decided it could save $10,000 a year a couple of years ago by installing solar panels on its roof. Not to make fun of Kentucky, but it's really fun to make fun of Kentucky. Last year, something really amazing happened. This is the power sources for electricity in America. Last year, renewable clean energy passed coal use for the first time in history. And you can see from these graphs that that's only going to accelerate. Coal is gone. Part of it is because this is the price of solar cells. Solar panels are a commodity being pumped out by Chinese factories and shipped everywhere. And that's making them cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. What a form of power that used to cost $80 a watt when I was growing up now costs under 20 cents a watt. And wind energy, same thing. We're using so much more of it because the price of the installations is going down so much. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is why it's not a good investment. You don't want to be investing in something that's a race to the bottom, in commodities that are plummeting. So good for the world, bad for investment returns. But that doesn't mean you can't be clever. What you do want to do is invest in people who stand to gain from the surge in clean renewable energy. 38 of our states have set mandated government renewable energy goals. So for example, New York and California will be 50% solar and wind and nuclear by 2030. So who will be supplying that energy to them? It's going to be the utility companies. It's going to be the electric companies. And some of the ones here, NextEra and Xcel, are dedicated to replacing dirty electricity with clean electricity. And they have a built-in customer. It's all these states that have already mandated that they have to go green. So that would be a good place to put your money. A lot of people say, how about electric cars? We all know that every single car company on the face of the earth has said that they are either replacing their internal combustion engines or greatly diminishing them with electric cars, including, if you can believe it, General Motors. General Motors, the oldest, most slow-moving, calcified, corrupt corporate, in bed with the gas companies. I mean, General Motors is going to stop making gas cars entirely in 13 years. And they've said it publicly. It's amazing to me. It's not that they're all such do-gooders. It's because of the other car companies. If they want to sell cars at all, they're going to have to be electric cars. They're being supported by the government, as you may have heard. This is a law that is passed. This is happening. The government's going to build $500 million worth of charging stations all over the country to relieve the anxiety of owning an electric car. Another thing you can do, if you want to think even farther upstream than individual car companies, is think to yourself, well, what do they all need? They all need batteries. And at the moment, that technology is lithium ion. So there's only 4 companies in the world that make lithium ion car batteries. They're all Asian companies: Panasonic, Amperex, Samsung, and LG. Or you could invest in the companies that make the components that every electric car needs, you know, the capacitors and the wires and the transistors. Or think even farther upstream, you could invest in the lithium mining companies that extract the lithium out of the earth to make batteries with. There's some other ways that you can think strategically for investment. I've mentioned the water problems. There are mutual funds and ETFs that invest in nothing but water, purification, transportation, desalination of water. Also, I don't know how many of you guys are gardeners, but you know how in the back of every package of seeds, there's this USDA map of the growing zones of the country? Well, that shows you which zone this package of seeds will grow well in. Well, if you look at the top right here, the latest USDA growing map zones have shifted northward. So as the earth heats up from the equator outward, the growing zones of this country are shifting to the north. So that is why, I mean, we all know these companies are evil, but if you want to invest, Monsanto and Syngenta are breeding drought-resistant crops to grow in this hotter, drier era. And of course, as the whole thing shifts northward, there are companies like John Deere and Navistar that make farm equipment. So what we're saying is there are going to be new farms in new places, and they're going to need to buy farm equipment. Now we come to by far the most heart-pounding, exciting part of the talk. This is how to insure. My wife makes fun of me. She says I could dominate 2 hours of a cocktail party just talking about the National Flood Insurance Program. But it's really interesting. I promise. It's really interesting. So you know the old Geico thing, 15 minutes could save you 15% or more. Turns out 15 minutes is not enough to look over your insurance policy. Things have changed. You probably bought your home insurance years ago. You probably signed up for the lowest possible cost, but the world has changed. You should check to see exactly what yours covers, especially when it comes to flooding. Flooding is a huge national issue. This graph shows the number and the size of flood claims to the federal government. They are up 4 times in 10 years. And the real shocker for you guys is that despite this fact, your homeowner's insurance does not cover flooding. That comes as a bolt from the blue to a lot of people. If you want flood insurance, you will have to buy it as a separate policy. In 1992, when Hurricane Andrew took out Florida, all the, Allstate and Nationwide, they all got out of the flood insurance business. They're like, no one can make money under these circumstances. So the government had to step in and create the National Flood Insurance Program. A lot of people are like, well, I don't live on the coast, so I don't need to worry about flooding. This map shows you the top 10 most flooded states of 2019. And guess what? Only 2 of them are coastal states. And number 1 is Arkansas, of all things. And you're like, well, how could that be? How could inland states be the most flooded? And it's because of that syndrome that we were talking about earlier, where the hot, dry weather makes the ground all parched. And then a big, heavy freak rain comes. It has nowhere to soak in. So it just flows across the ground into the cities and the homes and the businesses. So it's a growing problem, not covered by homeowners insurance. So in the 70s, Congress said, okay, we will form this thing called the National Flood Insurance Program. It's run by FEMA. And it's basically an insurance program run by the government, but it's drastically in debt. They're $25 billion under after all the hurricanes we've been having. And part of it is that the insurance rates that they give you are just crazy, whacked out, obsolete. They count, when they assess your rates, they count only the historical flooding of where you live, not the current situation or the future situation. Repeat customers are totally fine with the government. If you get flooded over and over and over, they will never raise your rates. There's this one house in Texas, I mentioned in the book, that since 1993, they've been flooded like 9 times. They've collected $3.5 million from the government, and their rates have never gone up. And they use these super coarse geographical measurements. So they don't just look at your property. It's more like your zip code. So this makes everybody crazy, right? It doesn't make any financial sense. And year after year after year, the FEMA people go to Congress and say, can we please update the data we use for these rates? We could make this program solvent. And year after year after year, Congress says, nope. You know why? Because guess what? There's only 2 kinds of voter in this country. There are voters who've been paying too little all these decades for flood insurance from the government, whose rates will suddenly jerk upwards, and they'll be furious at their Congress people. And then they're the kind who've been paying too much all this time, and their rates will suddenly plummet, and they'll be furious because they've been paying too much all these years. So to Congress, it's a non-starter, and the program is just going to just keep circling the drain. I mean, isn't that fascinating? I think it's hilarious. So you do have to wonder what is going to happen to insurance. In Florida, it's the flooding insurance. In California, it's the fire insurance. They're literally dropping out of the business. I mean, if you're an insurer, there are only 3 ways you can stay solvent. You can drop customers who are in risky areas, and they're doing that by the hundreds of thousands. You can raise your rates, and they're doing that. Or you can just leave the state, just get out of the business, and they're doing that. So I asked one of the insurance experts I was talking to with this book, like, so what's going to happen? And he said, all I can think of is that people will learn to self-insure, which means that only rich people can do it. Like only rich people are going to have insurance, and everybody else is going to have to fend for themselves. I mentioned that there are chapters in the book on all the individual disasters: flood, hurricane, heat wave, high winds, wildfires, droughts, so on. But I'm going to just summarize some of the general stuff for you now in this chapter called Ready for Anything. There are certain free things that anyone can do this weekend and feel better about how prepared you are. The thing that really breaks my heart about the wildfires out on the West Coast is when you hear that people died in their homes because they didn't get the word. They didn't find out that the fire was coming, or same thing with the hurricanes. And so that is why I can't see any reason you all shouldn't download this American Red Cross app. It's free, super simple to use. It's for iPhone and Android. You can get it right now. It's just called Emergency. And basically the way it works is you put in your address and the address of your children, your parents, whatever, and then you can forget about the app. You can file it away in a folder. But if any disaster ever comes toward one of those addresses, it can be a climate disaster or a nuclear leak or a chemical spill, anything, this thing springs to life, beeping, vibrating, chiming, and gets your attention. So you will get the word. And then there's immediate links to shelters and there's first aid instructions all built into this app. It's excellent. You guys are familiar with go bags, I'm sure. Really good idea to have one. The only thing I would add to the basics, which is pack a backpack full of 2 days of the stuff you need to survive away from your house. The only thing I would add to that is tape a note to it when you stick it in the front closet, reminding you of the last minute stuff you're going to need. So you're going to need your ID, your money, your meds, and maybe your phone charger. Those are the last things. And the reason you want to go bag is when something's coming your way, you don't want to be running around gathering stuff and killing time. You want to get on the road as soon as you can. One thing a lot of disasters have in common is a loss of water. In 700 major US cities, the sewer and the rain pipe drainage systems are one and the same. So when it floods, the sewage overflows and it can back up into the water supply or even into your home. So where are you going to get drinking water during a disaster? Well, a lot of people will rush to the grocery store and try to buy bottled water, and they will discover that it's all gone. So there are some actual good sources of water, already clean and pure, inside your home. One of them is your hot water heater. So what you do is you shut the thing off, turn off the intake, and now you can pour water out of the bottom spout into a bucket, let it cool, and you've got clean, chlorinated water ready to drink. There's also a few gallons of water in every one of your toilets. I don't mean drink out of the bowl, unless you're a golden retriever. I'm talking about the tank, of course. There's good water in there, and there's water if you have a multi-story house in the pipes going upstairs. So you turn off the water, you open a faucet in the attic to let the air in, and then you can get water out of the spigots on the lower floors. You've got plenty of sources of gray water too. This is not water to drink per se, but it's water for taking a bath, washing dishes, washing clothes, watering the garden. You can get water like that out of your hot tub or rain barrels, or even the bathtub that you filled up in advance of the disaster. The United States is #1 in the developed world in power outages. I did not know that. Yes, we get more power failures than any other developed country, and it's getting worse. Our grid is an ancient creaking disaster. So unfortunately, there aren't any free ways to protect yourself against a power outage, but you can get pretty cheap. From 15 bucks, you can get a hand cranked generator. It's got a flashlight and the emergency radio, and all it can generate power for is your phone or your tablet. It can get that charged up. It's not going to keep your refrigerator alive. For 250 bucks, you can go to Home Depot and get a generator that'll keep major appliances going. For 800 bucks, you can get these smaller, quieter ones called inverters. And then the ones that you might think of when you hear generator are these, they call them standby generators. These are the ones you get installed permanently. They use natural gas lines, so you don't have to keep fueling them. And my tip here is, we discovered after Hurricane Sandy hit us, and we had a horrible week without power, you don't have to power up your whole house. You can save a lot of money by getting a little one. Like we power up just the kitchen, the living room, and one bedroom. And we've been totally happy. This thing goes off about once or twice a year in blackouts, and we don't suffer anymore. So if you got the dough, it's the way to go. Remember that when the electricity goes down, there's something else that goes down, and that are the cell towers. In every major disaster, cell towers go down. And so you got to think to yourself, what happens to us if that happens? How are we going to communicate? So that's why the last thing that I would suggest you do over dinner some night with the family is plan out what you would do if you were all at work, at school, you were separated when a disaster hit and you couldn't communicate. The only way to do it is to agree now in advance where you're going to meet up. So you want 3 places. You want to pick an indoor spot, someplace away from windows, like internal bathroom or basement or attic, so that glass won't blow in at you. You want a neighborhood spot, like maybe the mailbox at the end of the street, in case you can't get to your house. And you need a place in town, like the library or the Walmart or something, where if they've taped off your entire street and the authorities won't let you in, you'll know where to go. You'll all have and then once you got this list of 3 places, put it in everybody's notes app on their phone, put a copy on the fridge and put a copy in your glove compartment, because 3 years from now, you'll have forgotten what you decided. So have it ready. Here's another one that doesn't get a lot of media play, but ticks love the climate crisis. As the planet warms, as the winters get milder, they do not die off during the winter months like they used to. In some areas, they're getting 2 entire reproductive cycles per year. instead of just one during the summer. And as a result, we're getting a lot more diseases courtesy of these things. Lyme disease is a real disaster. You really don't want Lyme disease. It's awful. It's vague. There's no good test for it. If you know you have it right away, you can get antibiotics and that takes care of it for good. But if you don't, it can linger for many years and the symptoms are vague. It's brain fog and tiredness and weakness that varies and it comes and goes. So that's on the rise here and in Canada as well. The CDC doesn't do a lot of surveys of cases, but in 1996, they had 30,000 reported Lyme cases. In 2014, they had 30,000, and they think it's more likely 300,000 because it's so underreported. So many people don't know that that's what they have. One of the most fun conversations I had was with this guy at the University of Rhode Island, who's like the tick guy for the United States. He knows everything about ticks. He goes out all summer long with this bed sheet, a pillowcase, and he goes strolling through the underbrush trying to catch ticks on his pillowcase so he can see it against the white. And then he studies them and what kind they are and where they've come from and are they carrying disease. He told me the most interesting things. So it turns out people think, I'm afraid of walking in the woods because I know those ticks are up there in the trees. They're just watching for me to pass down so they can jump down. No, none of that. First of all, most ticks don't carry any disease at all. So just because you have a tick doesn't mean you're going to get sick. I mentioned about antibiotics. Ticks can't fly and they can't jump and they don't even have eyes. So they're not standing looking for anything. What they do is they stand on low ground level plants on their little hind legs and wave them in the air, wave their forearms in the air until something or some animal walks by, and then they grab on. So if you are at all concerned about Lyme disease, it's very simple. You spray yourself with DEET repellent. It's incredibly safe. It's been tested up the wazoo, and it's not a poison. It's not a toxin. It just smells bad to the ticks. Same thing with mosquitoes, by the way. Also, I learned, this is kind of cool, ticks die when it's dry out. They need humidity. Under 82% humidity, they dry out and die. So they suggest that if you're at all worried about, your patio or your kid's swing set, 9 feet of lawn around it is the moat you need. The ticks can't cross 9 feet of sunny lawn. They'll die out on the journey. So to them, it's Death Valley. If you do come back from a walk, here's what you do. You take off your clothes, you throw them in the dryer for 10 minutes on high. That kills off whatever's on them. And while you're standing there naked, you just look over yourself, check out the hairy bits, make sure there's nothing on you. Because this is wild. You can't get Lyme disease unless a tick has been stuck on you, sucking for 48 hours. So if you can find it within a couple of days, you're safe. And finally, when it comes to removing a tick, you do find, just in this one case, the internet has misinformation. They say pull it out with, light it off with a match or Vaseline. No, take a pair of tweezers, pluck it out from the head, and then mail it to the University of Rhode Island guy so he can study it. We had an interesting conversation, my editor and I, about whether we should cover social unrest. Remember what happened during Katrina? Society just fell apart. There was no authority figures. The police themselves were looting stores. The traffic lights were out. There was absolutely, it was Lord of the Flies. There was just no sense of sanity. So, like, should we talk about having a gun? Having a gun and your attitudes depend on where you live and the culture you grew up in. I'm certainly not going to arbitrate it. I mean, we all know the statistics. It's very dangerous to own a gun, no matter whether you love guns or not. So the question is, if you're worried about, home invasion during a social unrest, should you have a gun? And so I spoke to a couple of survivalists. They're avid gun owners, and they told me, actually, what works better? Lighting. Automatic lighting. You can buy it for super cheap at Home Depot, solar powered, and they deprive an intruder of a decent hiding place. Remember, they don't particularly care about robbing your house. They just want to rob somebody's house. So if yours is well lit, they'll look for one that has better concealment. He also recommended this thing, tactical flashlights. These are the ones used by the police and the military. They're rugged, shockproof, incredibly bright. They're so bright that when you get blasted in the face with one of these things, it's disorienting. I mean, you forget which way you're going. And, you know, criminals and muggers, they hate drawing attention. So, and I've seen people on Reddit say, I have one and it works. So I promised you a little good cheer at the end of this talk. I wrote the book during the Trump administration when it was very easy to get depressed. You know, the government had taken the words climate change off every federal website. We'd pulled out of the Paris Agreement. It just looked like no one was doing anything. Now, believe it or not, I don't care what your politics are, but it is true that we did vote into office a guy who spoke about climate change at every single appearance, every debate, every speech. And, you know, Biden is being blocked in a lot of what he wants to do by Congress, but his goals are the things in the box here. He wants tax credits for clean energy, subsidies for electric cars. He wants to do more R&D for carbon capture plants and so on. That not all that's going to pass, but the headlines you see around this slide, those are all things that actually happened. Those are all things that are actually done since Biden took office. It's a very different kind of headline than we had been seeing. The one piece of hope I clung to during those years was that even though the United States had pulled out of the Paris Agreement and its goals, half the states didn't. Half the states agreed to stay within the guidelines of the Paris Agreement. They said, we're staying in. And all through those 4 years, there was progress, even though the country was officially out of it. I was really encouraged. Believe it or not, our greenhouse gases are dropping substantially. It's not because we're all getting with the program and flying less and eating less red meat. It's mostly because we are switching from coal to natural gas, fracking, which is not clean either, but it's much cleaner than coal. So it's already having a beneficial effect on the greenhouse gases. There's all kinds of movements that are underway to plant the ultimate carbon removal technology, trees. Over and over and over, we're seeing these things. There's even a cryptocurrency called Forest Coin, where planting trees mines you more coins. And coal is phasing out not just the United States, but everywhere, including, believe it or not, China. Everybody says, oh, why should we do anything about climate change when China's going right ahead and polluting? It's more complicated than that. The president of China has promised to go for carbon neutrality before 2060. Maybe they'll make it, maybe they won't, but that's what they've publicly said. They joined the Paris Agreement the first time around and they re-upped last year. They are the world's largest installer of wind. They are the world's largest installer of solar. They haven't agreed to stop building coal plants in China, but they have agreed to stop building coal plants for other countries. That was a big business for Chinese industry. And if you look at India and China from space, you will see they are getting greener rather than less greener. So there are changes afoot. And globally, we mentioned solar and wind. There are also some really interesting things going on with nuclear. In the book, I wrote about two kinds in particular that are really interesting to me. Right now, we get nuclear power from an isotope of uranium called U-235. You might have heard of it. Turns out 99% of all uranium in the world is not U-235. It's a different isotope called U-238. And it can't be melted down. It can't be weaponized. So why haven't we been using that all this time? Because it can't be weaponized. When the United States developed nuclear power, they wanted to build nuclear bombs. It was decades ago. They wanted to come up with weapons and power at the same time. That's why they chose this isotope. Right now, we dig up U-238 and we throw it away. Literally, we throw it away. So Bill Gates, Department of Energy, and one of the national labs is working on developing traveling wave nuclear. That's the kind that will use 238. And then there's another kind that's underway in 6 different countries called thorium. That's another element from the Earth that's not uranium. In fact, there's 500 times as much of it in the Earth's crust as there is uranium. Again, it can't be melted down, it can't be weaponized, and it produces almost no nuclear waste, and it doesn't need a cooling pond. So you can build these plants anywhere the electricity is needed. So overall, there are some huge transformations in power. And there's also huge transformations. A lot of people say, like, why should I install LED bulbs in my house? As a mere citizen, there's hardly anything I can do about the climate crisis. And that's kind of true. The much bigger polluters are corporations and governments. Okay, over. So that's what's interesting, though. The big polluting corporations are themselves switching away from being polluters. It's suddenly become embarrassing. It's become a matter of shame to have high emissions. All of these companies have committed to 100% renewable by whatever date. There's this really cool website, maybe you know about it, called CDP. It used to stand for the Carbon Disclosure Project. These guys track self-reported climate emissions and vulnerabilities of 13,000 major corporations. It's for investors. This website is for investors who want to know what they're getting themselves into. Nobody wants to invest in a company that's going to be vulnerable to climate change. Like, guess where all the cruise lines are, you guys? They're all in Miami, and they're all in big trouble. And they want to know which companies are big producers of greenhouse gases. Nobody wants to invest in those companies. So already you're seeing in these reports some astonishing news. You know, Amazon didn't even have a climate program 2 years ago. These companies are under pressure from 3 different directions: the investors, like we said, and consumers, of course, but also their own internal employees. Amazon now has an ambitious climate program because the employees practically rose up in a mutiny and said, hey, Bezos, do something or we're going to walk out. And so now they're spending $10 billion on climate science. They're going to replace all their vans with electric and all that stuff. Microsoft, this is really ambitious. They're already carbon neutral. By 2030, they intend to be carbon negative, taking more carbon out of the air than they're putting in. And by 2050, they want to have removed all the carbon they've ever put into the air since they were founded in 1979. Now, if you do a little math, you realize there's only 2 possible ways they can do that. One is to plant trees. That's the only way you can take carbon out of the air, other than building carbon removal plants. I'm doing a cool story about this technology for CBS Sunday Morning, so stay tuned. In a few more weeks, you'll see that underway. So those are some pieces of good news. Overall, I would say there are 2 reasons to prepare for climate change. First of all, the obvious one: you will be ready when disaster strikes you. You will have made taken some steps that protect you, your family, and your home. And the other stealth reason is that you'll feel better about things. You'll know that some things are in your control and you've taken some steps. You'll sleep better at night. I do believe that decarbonization will come. A lot of psychologists told me that people really don't change their opinions until they actually witness what we're talking about. And already 50% of Americans say they've seen it firsthand. So that's only going to grow, that number, with every passing year. And if you just look at who is doing the protesting and the marching every year, it's young people. It's largely young people. We, the governments and the corporations and the elected officials who are dragging our heels, are going to age out. We're going to die off. And these are the people who are going to take our places. They are growing up with this mission in their hearts. and they will be taking care of the problem. I think it'll take maybe 80 years to decarbonize in the way we need to, but I do think it's coming. Until then, I advise you to prepare. Thank you so much. I'm sorry I can't be there in person to autograph books, but I have a very special deal to offer you. If you do get the book and email me, here's my address, I will sign for you a custom book plate, an autographed sticker, which I will mail you in the mail, and you can paste it into your book just as though I was there. Anyway, so there's a little talk, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. That was so great. There are a lot of questions.
Oh, yes. Shall I start just plowing through them? Or do you want to pick your favorites, Amy?
No, we could. I'm just going back in time.
Some of it's just commentary, so you might not want to hit all of it. I don't know.
Yeah.
Oh, good. I see some people backing me up. Nick says that the cdp.net is a great resource. It's really cool. You know what else? Not all the companies on there are saying, oh, we're so vulnerable to the climate crisis. The pharmaceutical companies, more often than not, they say, okay, here's what we think is happening. This is going to be great for our business, because more disasters means more sick people and more people needing our medicines. Bayer said that we see our earnings going up 35%. It's like amazing. Amy asked, what do you think about carbon offsetting? Oh man. As you guys must know, the carbon offset thing is controversial. We don't want to, even if it worked perfectly, we don't want to make it like, oh, rich people can buy themselves out of responsibility. There are plenty of carbon offset outfits that are illegitimate. And even if you do have, so you know what a carbon offset is, right? You agree to give money that will ultimately go to a project that will remove carbon from the air, like a forestation project, or persuading a Brazilian farmer not to burn down his section of the rainforest. The problem with these is that you have to, first of all, prove that the money is going to do something. Like if the guy takes your money and doesn't burn down his forest and then does it 2 years later, you haven't accomplished anything. So it has to be verifiable. There have to be people who go down there and check. Second, you have to make sure that it's not you're not just displacing it. If the Brazilian rainforest guy promises he's not going to burn down, but then a guy two fields away burns his down instead, you haven't achieved anything. So it has to be something that's inspected and supervised by one of these nonprofits that does that. And overall, everybody agrees it's a much, much worse solution than just not pumping methane and carbon dioxide into the air in the first place. So if there's ever a choice, don't take that flight. If you do take the flight, pay the carbon offset fee. It's better than doing nothing, but not flying is the best bet. Let's see. What was my email address again? Pogue, my last name, Pogue @me.com, M-E. Yeah, Alex mentions solar powered geothermal heat pump and hemp homes for the wind. Yeah, I was, so I don't know why heat pumps aren't more of a thing in this country. They're really big in Europe and Asia. These are, though you might have seen them up on the ceilings in certain homes. It looks like a weird elongated air conditioning unit, and it treats your home like a refrigerator. So your home is the kitchen and the outdoors is the refrigerator. So it literally pumps heat from the outdoors. Even when it's cold, it finds heat and pumps it into your home. Way more efficient than gas or oil or any of the things we burn for heat, and does cooling the opposite direction. It's something like a quarter of the cost. I'm happy to say that I am soon to become an empty nester, and we have just bought a house, my wife and I, that's half the size of this one, and to our delight, it's got heat pumps. It's really cool. Geez, that's depressing. I know, Bernadette, I'm sorry. Yeah, Colleen says, I wish the Biden administration wouldn't tie climate initiatives in with other things. I don't know, though. I mean,
Politics.
it is politics. Like, isn't that maybe the only way to get them passed? Because if they said, you know, we would like to do this climate thing, then the Republicans would just say, vote it down. But if it's tied to things that the Republicans want, it might have a chance. Do you cover adaptation of the food supply and what to expect given the impacts of aquifers and agriculture? Yes, but again, this book is not about mitigation and the climate crisis problem at large. In fact, it was when I originally turned in the manuscript. My editor called and said, "You are aware that you just turned in a 1,000-page book." So she encouraged me to focus it somewhat. So you will find this 300-page free downloadable appendix on the Simon & Schuster website that contains the stuff I had to cut out to focus the book just on adaptation. What do you foresee for the future or of regenerative agriculture and its contributions? Now, by that, do you mean the aquaculture, the soilless things, or do you mean just smart, non-tilling native plant rotation, that kind of thing? I'm not sure which you mean by regenerative agriculture. Venus, are you still around? Okay. Let's see. Hempcrete. Oh, yeah. Is it evaluated as an official construction material? Yeah, you know, you guys must know concrete is a disaster. It is such a disaster. It is, what is this? It is the second most consumed, no, cement is the second most consumed human material behind water. We use so much cement, and making cement requires so much heating and so many fossil fuels burned. It is like way up there in the list of things we have to fix. I spent an entire day at a cement factory in the Midwest for a NOVA special, and it's just horrifying. Every building, every road, every sidewalk you see is just a disaster. But again, there are people working on it. For my podcast, Unsung Science, I'm profiling this cool company in Europe who's found out a way to do it by replacing the limestone with other stuff. It doesn't have to be heated up this much. So yeah, so there are all kinds of, oh, Vita says primarily non-tilling. Yeah, I just listened to the audiobook of the Omnivore's Dilemma. And man, if you weren't already convinced that eating red meat is a problem, woo! But in one of those chapters, he visits a guy who's created a completely self-fulfilling, cyclical, regenerative farm. So the poop from the cows provides grubs for the chickens to eat, who lay the eggs, and then they kill the chickens, and the body parts fertilize the field for the cows to graze. And it's a big cycle that involves no chemicals, no fertilizer. It's very cool. Soil, not oil. That's right. Oh, I'm sorry. Hempcrete is an insulating material. My embarrassment. Anyway, how do we get Biden to concede to Juliana et al? Oh, Pam's two kids are plaintiffs in the lawsuit. Wow, I did write about that lawsuit in the book as an example. It's in the chapter of how to talk to your kids, and it's an example of what kids can do if they band together. And there are a lot of groups getting together. I mean, you know, Pam, as well as I do, it's politics. It's how much of a voice do you raise? It's who do we elect? It's how many of us vote. Still, astonishingly low numbers vote at all. We have to make people aware. And I think the more that last graph I showed you of the number of Americans who are witnessing this stuff themselves, sooner or later, that's going to change some minds. It's depressing how slow it is, but it's going to happen. Thoughts on managed retreat from the coastlines? Yeah, I mean, the federal government is finally buying homes in the floodplains and knocking them down. They finally are getting around to doing that, realizing that it's cheaper to do that than to keep paying to rebuild these places in hurricane after hurricane. I mean, obviously, it's really disruptive. It's really upsetting. It's where you grew up. But dude, some things are not changeable. And one of them is the encroaching sea. I don't see any other way. Be glad you have a place to move. Be glad you don't live in Bangladesh or low-lying countries where there is literally nowhere else to go. There's a brief section in the book about climate migration, which is just an absolutely terrifying thought. The United Nations predicts 200 million people will have to move by the middle of the century because they just can't live where they are anymore. It's too hot, it's too dry, they can't grow stuff. So they literally have to move. And where are they going to move? It's a real problem. I mean, the Ben Strauss, who runs Climate Central, in his interview, he kind of half joked. He said, we're going to wind up building that wall along the Mexican border, like even if you're progressive, because someday everybody south of us is going to want to be alive and they're going to pour into this country no matter what we do. The same thing in Europe. That was one of the big causes of the Syrian war. It's people in rural Syria who couldn't live anymore. They couldn't grow anything. And so they poured into the cities and one thing led to another. So anyway, something else for you to worry about tonight.
Well, the questions are pouring in. Did you see there's one from Brian? And then there's one from Kelly, I see, that just came in.
Yeah. By the way, a couple of good PSAs there. There's a youth climate strike march this Friday, I guess, right near where you guys are. Oh, and there's a documentary on Netflix called Youth versus Gov about the Juliana lawsuit. Let's see. Brian says, every expert feels their area is the answer: economics, politics, education. It's all of these things, but it can sound overwhelming. How can that be addressed from a do something perspective? Yeah, I don't know. I do feel like we generally have the directions we need to go. I mean, we all know that it's decarbonizing. That's it. Everybody is pointing their ships toward that. It's decarbonizing. And the big three are energy, transportation, and construction. Those are the big three. And then there's agriculture close right after that.
And then.
What's that?
Yeah, and then
yeah, and
then if we fix it, and that's the issue.
Yeah, that is true. And hanging over all of it is inequity.
Yes.
Quality, like how do we do it so we don't make the poor people poorer? How do we do it so that the rich people don't get off by buying themselves out of the situation or just moving into a more northward place, leaving behind everybody else to suffer? I was happy to hear Biden say over and over and over, we need to fix the climate problem and we need to fix it equitably. I just, it's the Obama problem. He faces a hostile Congress, and I don't see any way around that. There are some cool bipartisan ideas, and I don't know why these aren't on everybody's lips. There's this really cool bipartisan carbon tax proposal. And the idea is it would be a cap and trade program. It would be a carbon, basically the bigger the pollution you pump out, your company, the more you put into this pot. But the reason both parties like it is because guess who gets the pot? The public. We get the proceeds by finding these big polluters. And so everybody else, so the conservatives and the Republicans love this idea because it takes hands off the market. It's it's not regulation. It's just a marketplace. And then progressives love this idea because it presumably helps the people who need it, and it punishes the people who are the biggest causes of the problem. So I think that's ingenious. I mean, we need more ideas like that.